Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at the email I'm putting into the chat box, or you can contact any of our presenters via the emails at the end of the slide or at the end of the presentation. And that is Hanovi at red-wind.net. Joining us today are Wyanet Tasker and Raquel DeHerrera. Wyanet Tasker, who is of Lumbee and Eastern Band of Cherokee, is Redwind's Housing and Homeless Services Tribal Technical Assistance Coordinator and was previously the Children and Youth Tribal TA Coordinator. She's a graduate of Colorado College, where she majored in neuroscience and has been working with survivors of trauma since 2005. She has direct services experience in a residential treatment facility, school setting, shelter, and housing program. She has been providing culturally specific training and TA since 2015 and has developed expertise with special survivor populations such as children and youth, male survivors, Two-Spirit and LGBTQ+, and survivors with disability. She's authored Creating a Safe Space to Grow, a guide for tribal child and youth advocacy, and serves as a co-trainer for Redwind's Consulting's survivor sexual assault tribal advocate trainings, which are SADIs, and our domestic violence tribal advocate trainings, our DADIs. Raquel is of Taos Pueblo. Sorry, I always mess this up. Raquel, Chiricahua. Sorry, how do you pronounce
Chiricahua.
Chiricahua, thank you. Apache and Mexican descendant. She has been with Redwind for 5 years now. She is currently the program coordinator for our TCC, which is our Tribal College and Campuses grant. She is working towards her master's in sociology, where her topics of interest include families, gender-based violence, power and privilege, and settler colonialism. She has been a trainer for the National Tribal Advocate Center and has presented at Redwind's Creating Sister Space, Creating an Interconnected Web of Support, which is our conference. And she has been working on decolonizing trauma work and safety planning in a transitional housing program, along with creating a Safe Place to Heal conference. She has also provided webinars on documentation within tribal transitional housing programs, safety planning in a transitional housing program, educational groups, and decolonizing trauma. Before we begin, if you have any questions during the webinar, you can type them into the chat box or click the hand icon, and we will be notified of that. Also, if you find that the presenter cameras are obscuring any of these slides, you can move them to the top or bottom, depending on which is better for you. And I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Hanovi, for that introduction. It was a long one, longer than normal, just because we have 2 presenters on here. So it's a lot of words to come out. Just want to thank everyone for being here. I don't know, Wyanet, if you want to just introduce yourself and we can get started. I know what Novi's introduced us, but just wanted to say welcome for joining us and so happy to have you here.
Yeah, we'll be going through the slides and kind of talking through them together. I'm Wyanet. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. At different points, we'll be asking you to kind of participate and interact with us, because we do want to hear what you're doing in your communities. We work on the national level, and you're really the expert in your own communities. And so we do want to hear from you. And if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be great too.
Absolutely. I think this is just a webinar, especially I think when we center our culture, where it's just more, conversational. It's not formal. So if you have something that you want to put in the chat, please, by all means, do that. And the more interactive, the better, because we all learn from each other. So thank you. And with that, we'll start. If Hanovi, can you change the slide to the next one? We're talking about centering our culture within our response. So if you are an urban native response, or even, a native specific response, this can be applicable really. I like to start webinars and just presentations with a quote to kind of to give an idea of what, where I'm coming from when it comes to presenting. And I think this quote really speaks to this webinar to me, and it's, "We have indigenous solutions to our problems." And Wilma Mankiller has stated that, and that just is something that kind of guides me when I think about the work that we're doing. We really have, the tools necessary to really respond in our communities. And I think if we lead with our culture, that's how we ensure that we're centering culture within our program's approach to supporting our relatives who have been impacted by violence. We do this by honoring our relationships, our connectedness with one another. And we do this by knowing, where we've been and where we're going. And I know that's kind of that cliche, but really, I think if we go back to where we've been and how we have done things, that really does bring us to how we lead our programs with our culture. And I don't know, Wyanet, if you have anything that you want to talk about, or?
Yeah, so a lot of programs think that, well, cultural values and cultural practices aren't things that are evidence-based, or things that your grant funders are thinking of as far as like an evidence-based program, or like a something that data has been collected on. But just because you may not have the data to, quote, prove that leading with our culture is important, it is essential as far as our healing. Um, and there are absolutely ways that you can build into your grant, ways that you can get different kind of cultural items and cultural practices built into your grant so that it is covered. Even if you think, well, I can't find this specific curriculum or something like that. We absolutely have Indigenous solutions, and we know that they work. So it's really important to build these into your practices.
And I think that's such a great point, Wyanet, because I think often we are working with grants that seem, it might be, there might be questions as to, can I do this in my program, or does this grant allow for that? And I think this webinar is going to kind of show you ways in which you can really incorporate your culture, and also, make sure that you're in compliance with your grant. And I think, unfortunately, as far as evidence-based, for a long time, it's been, I always think of trauma-informed care. And while that has a lot of scientific data to come out of it, I do think if we really look to the root of that, that is an Indigenous, I would say just an Indigenous philosophy perspective, where we really we're connecting and we're meeting the person where they're at. And so I always think of that as, we have these solutions, and it might be hard to find it. And you might come up and have pushback from funders, or, your grants person, but just, know that it is essential and it's worth diving into, and it's really worth, changing those perspectives on thinking about why it is critical to lead with our culture. Why is it critical to use our solutions to our community's problems that we're facing? And I think that is such a great point to point out, Wyanet. So thank you. Novi, can you go to the next slide, please? So something I just wanted to touch upon for culture, I think it's an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of things. You can look at it from just a plain definition. You can look at it through biology. Biology has, a definition of what culture is. And I think it's interesting because the biological definition is to maintain tissue cells, bacteria, et cetera, in conditions suitable for growth. And I think I'm a sociology person, so I think that kind of fits into that social definition of culture, that we're really promoting growth for our community and for those, our relatives and those who are in our community. We're really promoting growth. That's really what culture does. So I put some of these things that kind of encompass the social culture. According to the American Sociological Association, which is what I use because I think it's a good definition, is that, culture is the languages, customs, beliefs, rules, arts, knowledge, and collective identities and memories that were developed by members of that social group. And it kind of provides meaning for our world. So, thinking about the norms, what do we find? What is the norms that guides our behavior? What are our values? What are the values that we hold? And what are some of the beliefs that we have? When I think about beliefs, we know that women are sacred. We believe that. We believe that children are sacred. And with that belief, that kind of shapes our norms, shapes our behavior, shapes how we do things, shapes our morals, and customs. Customs then kind of support and kind of come together with some of those beliefs and values. So I think when we think about culture, thinking about that, really thinking about these are the things that kind of shape who we are, shape our belief systems, and thinking about that, I think it's going to be really important, because I think culture gets thrown around a lot, and we have an idea of what culture is, but do we really know what that means? Do we really break it down and understand, what does it mean? What does culture mean? And how does that apply to our program? And I think it might be hard, especially in an urban environment, where you're responding to, many Native communities, where, there's not going to be one set culture, one set belief, or one set, there's going to be many encompassing things that comes in. And I think finding, those universal values, those universal beliefs, and then building on that, I think that really, really helps in shaping how you incorporate culture into your program. So, and we'll kind of dive further into how to do that. But, I just wanted to start with thinking about, what does culture mean to you? And if that's something you want to put in the chat box, I would love to hear, like, what, when you think of culture, what are some of those things that you think about? And think, just kind of brainstorm. And I think this would be a great, a team meeting, kind of just to break down culture. What does that look like? What are some activities that you would, identify with culture? And just, think about that, kind of broaden that idea of what culture is.
Yeah, I don't know how many of you have seen the culture glacier graphic, where they show like the glacier and a little bit is above the water and the rest of the culture is below the water. I think a lot of programs think, oh, well, language access, that's how I can build in accessible culture. Whereas for Indigenous people, there's so many different languages that's not a that's like the tip of that iceberg. When you really think about the culture, it's so much deeper than like just language access. And so really thinking about diving in deeper, and how can we really get in there and help people on a cultural level, not just making sure things are linguistically appropriate for them.
That's a great example because I think, again, language is part of culture, but it's also the meanings that we give to that language. I, a great, I think a great example of this is, there's a lot of talk. There's a movement where it's land back. I know, there's this idea, and I think that from an Indigenous perspective, it's not literally taking ownership of that land when it's land back. It's reclaiming that connection to the land. And I think language, someone who is not Indigenous will, especially when their culture, is very, there's an ownership component to it. They're going to interpret it as ownership. And I know I don't, this can be on so many levels. And I think it just, it's not just kind of accessing that language, it's really meeting them in that cultural space that I think Wyanet was talking about. That meanings are very different, even though they're the same words, but based on our culture, based on our values, based on our beliefs, that language can mean very different things to people, but yet be the same exact words. So that's a great example. Novi, can you move to the next slide, please? So I think this is a great segue into this slide and what I want to talk about. I think when we want to look at responding to victims and survivors, our relatives who have been impacted by violence, I think it's important to look at that in an Indigenous way or in a cultural way. So defining what is violence, what does that look like? How does our community define that? And again, in an urban native area or where you have many tribes represented in your program, it's not going to be one size fit all, but really finding some of those universal belief systems that help guide your work. And this is from Mending the Sacred Hoop, their website, and they have great resources that I just love. And it really talks about how did, all of these things, what does it look like? What does sacred nonviolence look like? And I think this is so important because, in our program, we want to think about, are we promoting fairness and economic partnerships in our programs? If you're a housing program, are you promoting fairness? Is this an economic partnership, or is this, this hierarchical, we're providing you a stipend, and it kind of creates this hierarchy rather than a partnership of us working together. So, thinking about all these things, we really want to look at culture and how it defines where we're going. How did we respond to violence pre-colonization? How do we respond now? How can we lead and structure our programs that encompasses these beliefs, surrounds us in, a shared responsibility of, making our community great? Is there non-threatening behavior that we are as a program making sure we're instilling in our programs? Something I think about, just kind of our language we use. And this reminds me of, I had helped a program, an urban native program, with their policies, and it was a shelter. And they really wanted to create, it was kind of like a rules for their participants who were staying in the shelter. And how do they do that? And I think part of it was just making sure that we're instilling fairness. I think a great thing to do would just even kind of use some of this language that you don't fight, you treat everyone with respect. And it's not in a threatening way. It's not, the language isn't, you're going to be kicked out if you do this. It's already kind of turning this negativity. So I think about our language and really knowing what our values are. And so I think that comes with starting to just look at our own policies, our own materials that we're handing out, and to see if they line up with this. I think this is a great tool to set, maybe with your team members and be like, okay, how are we promoting fairness in our program? How are we promoting an economic partnership in our program? How are we, instilling that, women and children are sacred and it's a shared responsibility? How are we, challenging rigid gender roles that weren't our traditions to begin with? How are we incorporating that in our work? How's the language that we're using? I remember when I first started this work and I was trying to put together a transitional housing policy, and the template that I had used had terminated, terminating your, basically terminating your participation in the program. And, even just that language itself, when we think about from a historical context, that really isn't, it's not appropriate historically from a historical context. But then you think about Indigenous perspectives, like, is that a language we would use? Is that something that we would, do? So just thinking about that, how do we as a community respond and view violence? So really thinking about that and using this as a guide. I think it's a great way to start thinking. It's a great reflective tool to start looking at your program and see how you're promoting sacred nonviolence beliefs into your program.
Yeah, I love this graphic because it starts out with the power and control tactics on that outer rim, the like black rim with the white writing. And then we typically do see a lot of like, here's these red flags, but this builds in like green flags, like the opposites of what we see from power and control strategies. And so I really like this graphic because it does give that contrast that we don't usually see. I also love the idea of using this to build your policies and procedures. I've heard of different shelters and housing programs talk about how they don't really have rules, but they have like guidance, so that it's a little less, we're trying to control you through these rules. It's just, here's our guidance, here's how we're trying to get back to our traditional ways, and this is how we're building it into our program. And so I do think that's a really awesome idea, to use this to build your guidance rather than your rules for whatever program that you're in.
Yeah, I love the green flags too. And I think I love that it kind of gets us back to, okay, we know violence and what's going on, or we might not, but we also want to know, what does it look like to not have violence? And, I think it just brings humanity and connectedness back. So yeah, it's a great tool.
I think especially for youth, I think that we give them a lot of like, no, don't do this, stop doing this. Um, but we don't give them a whole lot of, but this is an alternative. Um, so, you don't engage in unhealthy coping skills, but we don't give them alternatives. And so, or this is what you should look for in a toxic relationship or a toxic friendship, but we don't really give them the opposite of like, what kind of things should you be looking for that are really positives in relationships. So I do like the positives in this one.
Me too. I do too. And I think it is great for youth, to see, you know, um, just what it looks like. What does sacred nonviolence look like? And yeah, I think if you are really, you're a program that wants to incorporate some of this in your policies and really respond in a cultural way or centering that, I think this is a great way to start. Next slide, please.
All right, so you may have seen the power and control wheel. That last slide had the outer rim that had power and control tactics. Um, this is kind of a different graphic to show this unnatural power and control. It shows different strategies or tactics that are used to either obtain or maintain control over someone. Perpetrators of either domestic or sexual violence, both, use these kind of tactics consistently and pretty predictably. So the graphics that you use can be really important to help survivors of violence understand things like, oh, this isn't just something that happened to me. Like, I'm not the only person who's experienced this, because these tactics are really a reality for so many survivors. I like this graphic because it took the original power and control wheel and turned it into a triangle, which is more culturally appropriate because the circle is so sacred. Um, but a lot of the examples, at least at the top, are the same. So you'll see the things like male privilege up at the top of the triangle, which is kind of like I'm the king of the castle kind of stuff, um, and very strict kind of hierarchy of who makes decisions or what the roles are, and not like this equality and egalitarian kind of thing that we traditionally had. Then we move on to isolation, which is, you know, who you can talk to, who you can see. Are you allowed to call your family? Are you allowed to go visit your family? Um, if you are allowed, is there a fight afterwards when you come home to kind of discourage you from continuing that? Then intimidation, which can be like different looks, actions, gestures. It could be like destruction of property, emotional abuse, um, you know, name calling, making you feel guilty for things. Then minimizing, lying, and blaming, which is, you know, it's your fault that I did this, or I didn't even hit you. All I did was push you, things like that. Using children is the next one. Um, Children are often used in things like custody fights, or if you don't do this, I'm going to call Child Protective Services on you, things like that. Economic abuse. A lot of survivors either lose their jobs or can't continue with their jobs because of the abuse. And then coercion and threats, which is like, I'm going to leave you if you don't do this, or um, we see this making survivors do illegal things. You might see this with like sex trafficking, forcing someone to engage in sex trafficking. Um, so a lot of the very similar things that you'll see on a standard power and control wheel. The thing that I also like about this, though, are those last two, that cultural abuse and ritual abuse. So for me, I first started my healing journey by going to a very mainstream support group. It was super helpful, but I didn't get to talk about those last two things down at the bottom of the triangle. It wasn't until maybe like 10 years later when I actually found Redwind and the local program that Redwind has called HASIA, and they were doing a culturally specific education group, and I got to see this. Um, and it was really the first time that everything kind of clicked into place for me, and I did feel more, you know, quote unquote normal. Um, so if you're curious as to the difference between like a mainstream support group and then like a indigenous kind of group, those last two for me made a huge difference. Um, and they were also things that I couldn't really talk about during a mainstream group because no one would understand. I couldn't talk about things like, um, the blood quantum stuff being thrown in my face, or the kind of insults of your blood quantum and how much native you are and things like that. Or like the ritual abuse and spiritual abuse stuff of um, having like a medicine man. You know, I was told a medicine man would pray against me if I ever told anyone about the abuse. So that's just in one graphic, for me at least, this made such a big difference in my healing, because of that cultural aspect. And so when we talk about building that culture into your programming, it really does matter. And I don't know, Raquel, if you have something to add on that.
Yeah, I think, making sure that, when you have handouts, even just making sure you hand this out, because I think culture and, our rituals, that's a huge part of who we are. And that's a huge piece when you think about, talking about abuse or talking about your experience. and then not having kind of the background, or maybe meeting somebody who might not, talking to someone who might not have that as a background, it could be very hard, because that could be, one of the pivotal, impacts of violence. It could be that cultural abuse. It could be that, that could be a big part. And if, there's no way to talk about it, that could be internalized then, as not being part of the abuse, but being something that's wrong with me. And so I think, we really want to make sure we're providing a space and providing resources that really do provide that. And so I think this is just one great way that Wyanet, mentioned, to make sure that you, not only do you provide this as a resource, but really, as you're, responding to victims and survivors, Native victims and survivors, that you keep this on, you also have that as your background and guidance. And it goes back to also just the importance of the circle, that is a sacred circle, and to see that as a triangle. It's, it might not seem like such a big deal, but it really is. It really does make an impact when you're like, oh, it's a hierarchy. It's not our sacred circle of, of threats and violence. It's literally, this is unnatural power and control. And I think what I love, and a presenter that I had the honor of being, presenting with, and just, she's a wonderful person, Debbie Manuel, and she's in Arizona. She's a Dene woman, and she talked about power. And I remember thinking about power is this bad thing, right? Like, power is horrible, and nobody should ever strive to have power. And she, explained it, that it's a misuse of power that is not good, that we all are inherently have this power, but it's when we misuse it, that's when there's this, issue. And I think that kind of, that underneath says it's this unnatural power and control, that this isn't, in our communities, we know that it isn't natural for us to do these things, because we know to be a strong community, a strong nation, we need to be fair. We need to, all be equal and have value, and not have male privilege or isolation. We thrive in our communities. We thrive being around each other. We thrive when we are, gathered together. And so I think, just kind of putting it in that respect, I think, is so important. And I really appreciate that Wyanet added this to this PowerPoint, because I think this is key when we think about centering culture in our response. This is kind of how we want to look at violence, and see it as unnatural, and that it's not something that is traditional, and that there are cultural abuse and ritual abuse that happens. So.
Yeah, thank you for including that on Debbie. She is really amazing. And for highlighting that word unnatural. I like that. Yeah. Next slide, please.
So to kind of go back on, having an idea of what it means to look at violence from an Indigenous perspective, or, a Native perspective, I think we also have to look at healing and what that means. And a great book that I've read and that I love and has tabs everywhere is a book, Decolonizing Trauma Work. And her name, I think, is Rebecca. I can't remember the last name, something Water, and it bothers me that I don't know her name, but it's a great book. When I find the link, I'll put it in the chat box, but really is a great way to think about healing, that, it's not linear. It's not this idea. And I think, when you're working with victims and survivors, we have to look at it as it's continuous. It's not circular, or it's not linear, but it's circular. There's going to be times where you feel like you are healing, and then something happens, but it's just circular. It's this it's I like to think of it as seasons. There are seasons in your life that you are, continuously working on. And that we heal through ceremonies, songs, traditional teachings and knowledge that we have. Another great book, and I always go back to books, but is Ceremony, for that book by Leslie Marmon Silko, um, Ceremony, where that those ceremonies are so critical to our healing process. And I think one important thing that I have learned is that, when someone comes into the program, especially in an urban native program, they might not necessarily know what their ceremonies are or what that looks like, or they might not, be asking for it. But I think it's important to offer it and provide the space and provide those healing options, because I think, and even if they say, no, I don't want that, just to continuously, mention it, here it is, so that they know that it's there. And so I think that's another important piece, is just think about making sure in our, services that we offer or even refer out to, that we're including ceremonies, we're including, Wyanet mentioned a women's education group. I think that's one of the biggest things, and it goes down to healing through connection to community. To have, we heal through each other and with each other. And so providing spaces where victims and survivors, where people who are impacted by violence can come together and heal together. They heal through the connection to each other, the land, animals, and the universe. So thinking about that, providing some traditional medicines that are healing. So cedar, sage, sweetgrass, pollen, rocks, that, depending on where you are, that might guide what, traditional medicines you have on hand. I'll never forget, during, I think it was a domestic violence training, and we had some Alaska Native relatives in the training, and at the end of the training, a shell and some sage were handed out, and it, she was just like, what is this, and it goes back to that, things aren't, there's not this one way that we all practice healing, that there are going to be differences, there's going to be variety, and that just, was a great way to just reinforce that not everybody has the same practices. So, depending on where you're at, depending on, not to incorporate, things that you don't think will be applicable, just to keep that in mind. Keep in mind of traditional medicines that might not be your own, but maybe your coworkers, have an idea of what that looks like. And another thing with that Decolonizing Trauma book, the real focus here is on balance, that, trauma creates an imbalance. Violence kind of creates this imbalance, and that, not to say that you are going to be in balance for the rest of your life once you get there. It's always, a give and take, but really that striving is to find balance. And again, language, using Indigenous language to define trauma. And it doesn't have to be necessarily the language, I think we give meaning to language. So again, going back to not using termination in your policies, because that is in of itself could be very traumatic. Intergenerational trauma, just thinking about something, trauma informed. What we use at Red Wind often is just a relative centered response, that it's really sister space. How are we, how is our work helping us to connect to our relatives and do it in a way that we would do, for our sister? If we were working with, not working with, there's that language, but if we are with our sisters and they have experienced violence, how do you do that in a way? And we want to make sure we're doing that. And it's a great way to think about just healing that piece. And as Wyanet mentioned at the very beginning, this can be really hard, because when we look at it, a lot of the research that we have and even a lot of the indigenous knowledge that we have, sometimes some grants have an issue with it not being evidence-based. Like, well, is this evidence-based? Or is this something that we can prove works? And I think, that's always a hurdle we have when we are, working within a grant and we want to use part of our funds to kind of create a sweat lodge or whatever it might be. And so I think that's one piece that's just something that we might come up against, and being creative to figure out how we can do that. And that's where partnerships are wonderful. If you are a program that you are connected to your Indian Center, or if you're connected with other programs who have the ability, how do you create a partnership where you can provide these things and refer out and work together, so that you are able to provide, your participants something that is more of an indigenous perspective, indigenous view of healing. So just thoughts on that. I think, really starting to rethink what trauma is. And I think it's important to have, the mainstream, definitions, or, some of their, I don't want to call them labels, but just, having an idea of what they, some ideas for healing. And I think that has its place, but I also think we want to make sure we have some of these ways of healing, because we know, and through a lot of research, through a lot of ethnographic research, and we know that our indigenous perspectives on healing and traditional healing methods work best for our people. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I love this first line that healing is continuous and circular. If you think about the circle and building circles into the work that you do in all of your programming, our circle is sacred, therefore our healing is sacred. And then if you think about your partnerships and how you kind of have your inner circle, and then as you build out your networking, that it becomes this bigger circle of your partnerships and your networks, you'll have that, and it'll create connections for the survivors that you're working with, or the families that you're working with, and it'll build their circle too. And the bigger our circle is, the less isolated we are, the more healing can be done. Healing isn't something that we do alone. Like, we do it with others. We're all interconnected in this healing journey together. Even if you think about, how you learned different coping skills or different healing options. If you started journaling in middle school, who introduced that idea to you? Or if no one specifically said, hey, maybe try journaling or yoga or meditation or these kind of things, maybe you went to a store and you saw a journal and you started flipping through pages, and maybe it's like a gratitude journal, or like a sentence a day journal or something like that. Someone had that idea, someone shared that idea, someone made this journal possible, someone produced it, someone put it on the shelves. Like, we all are interconnected even when we don't think about each other. And so our healing is interconnected, our healing is circular, our social networks are circular. And so really keep that circle in your frame of mind when you're going through all of the healing processes that you can.
That's such a great point, because I think about the idea of self-care. And yes, we want people to focus on self-care, but if we don't have community care with that, of everyone taking care of each other, also, themselves, that it, kind of defeats the purpose. And I love that you said that, because really healing it isn't an individual thing that you do. It can be, but really it's, again, going to that indigenous perspective of that everything that we do is connected. We're interconnected in every way, shape, or form that we are to each other, to the animals in our lives, and to the trees, to nature, to, we are all connected somehow. And so I think that's really important that Wyanet brought that up, because healing is not, just something when you're working with a victim and survivor, that it's just them healing. That we really, and with decolonizing trauma work, that book really does talk about, we also have to keep doing our healing work, that we have to keep doing that, because it's really going to be hard to do that, to help someone through their trauma work and their healing process if we ourselves aren't doing that. So I really appreciate that. Next slide, Novi.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the historical, intergenerational, and personal trauma. So historical trauma is kind of this collective, group, complex trauma that has been inflicted on a group of people. And typically you think about this as a people who share a group identity or like a group affiliation. So that's how you can think about historical trauma. Intergenerational trauma has also been called like multi-generational trauma, or people might call it historical trauma too. But it's like this legacy of a lot of traumatic events over time that a community experiences. And it really impacts generations as you go kind of down the line of generations. And then kind of these social responses and traumatic responses and healing responses that happen over time that we kind of carry with us. So as Indigenous people, we've all experienced a life that is really interwoven with this intergeneration or historical trauma. And then each survivor that you work with, they're bringing their own personal or like individual trauma with them too. And so let me kind of give you a scenario to kind of wrap this all together. So you have Sarah, who just came into your program. So Sarah's tribe was forcibly relocated to a reservation, which resulted in a lot of death. Her grandpa was in World War II and kind of came back not quite the same from the war. Her dad enlisted as soon as he could to get away from the boarding school. So he went to Vietnam. When he came back, he didn't treat Sarah's mom right. Sarah's mom maybe started using alcohol to survive that. So without knowing anything about Sarah when she walks in the door, just knowing that stuff about her family, and I wouldn't suggest that you ask this of Sarah, but just knowing that stuff, which nothing that I said is abnormal about our Indigenous relatives, we know that she's got a lot of historical and that intergenerational trauma and grief that she's carrying. Definitely don't, put a survivor in a situation where they have to give you all of this backstory if they don't want to, don't make them feel required to tell you backstories, or, don't put it as a part of like their intake forms or something weird and formal like that. But right away, without knowing more about her, we would want to offer a different kind of supports and services to give her opportunities to heal just from the intergenerational and historical trauma. We can't necessarily, remove those layers, but what we can do is try to offer options that can make the layers less heavy. So when we talk about telling our stories and how we heal from trauma, Sarah might come in telling her story in ways that aren't necessarily healthy or productive. And so we can kind of like show other ways. We can help connect to other people who will show different ways to tell her story too. Maybe we have like an elder volunteer who can kind of quietly hold space for Sarah, or teach her how to bead when she's ready to do those kind of things. I have a Facebook friend who recently shared that she made a blanket, and for all of the major events in her life, she made like different layers of the blanket with different colors and different patterns. And it was like this really cool, creative and artistic way for her to tell her story. It's also a skill that she's learned, which is really awesome. And she can share that skill, and she can use it as a way of self-expression, which is really awesome for us to use our art in that kind of way. Um, Maybe Sarah can like connect with others in like a grief or a healing circle. Like we just talked about, our connections are really important, especially when you think about the power and control tactics that we talked about earlier, that like emotional abuse and um, the threats and the manipulation and all of that stuff, because isolation is really that glue that holds it all together. Abusers don't want us to be around our friends and families. They don't want us to connect to our communities because silence is what they want. They don't want us to have people to talk to like tell. And so, kind of bringing Sarah out of that isolation and connecting with people so that she can tell her story and she can connect. Um, that's hugely important. Um, Ultimately, keep in mind that these are all her choice. Um, Abuse involves a lot of boundary violations. So we really want Sarah to have an opportunity to establish new boundaries, reestablish boundaries. We want her to be able to say no. We want her to be able to say not yet. We want her to be able to say yes and actually mean it. Choice is such a hugely powerful thing, and ultimately, she's the expert in her life. You know, you're the experts in your communities. Sarah's the expert in her life. And so we want her to feel empowered to express herself, self expression, but also to express herself as far as her yeses and her nos, her maybes, her laters, all of that kind of stuff. So we're kind of walking alongside Sarah while she's telling her story and she's healing. We're not dragging her along, or making her feel coerced into participating in things that she doesn't want to when she's not ready to. Um, if she doesn't want to do mock interviews or budgeting classes or not yet, we don't want to use kind of like threatening language like, well, if you don't participate in budgeting, then you're terminated from our program, like that language stuff. What we really want to do is think about like strengths. What are her strengths? What is she already doing really well? How can she do more of that? How can we build on that? Rather than focusing on like this case plan that can feel really punitive. And I know personally when I did case management, case plans started to look all the same. We really want it to be individualized to what she needs. This is about her story. And we're really honored that she's willing to tell us her story, whatever amount that she wants to. We really want to hold her story as sacred. So if she really wants to go to budgeting classes and life skills classes and do mock interviews and all of that stuff, that's great if that's her goal. Um, but it's really important to not overly focus on, well, once she does this budgeting, she's healed and she can go. You know, the the budgeting classes might be really easy to do like a checkbox for rather than healing, which is circular. So you can say like, oh, well, we did this budgeting class, check. Whereas the healing stuff is really hard to put into a checkbox. And so it's really hard for programs to build in sometimes because um, it's so complex and it's so ongoing. Um, but we have to build in these opportunities. She needs to be able to express herself. She needs to connect. She needs to have some culturally specific services and supports available so that she can reconnect on that level too, um, for the historical, intergenerational, and any personal trauma that she's been through. And then with that as well, we really want to consider Sarah's other kinds of intersections. So when we think about her as a individual, so if you're not quite familiar with different intersections of trauma or intersections of who we are, kind of the roles that we play, um, maybe Sarah self-identifies as a two-spirit Indigenous woman who experienced violence. She maybe has a mental health diagnosis and a disability. So when you think about all of these kind of supports and services, Are they meeting her at all of her intersections? Are they really thinking about the historical intergeneration and her personal intersections? Are your services realistically accessible to her? And then how can culturally specific services and supports be realistically available to her and welcoming to her? So, thinking about all of that different stuff from her past to her present to these intersections, really thinking about the circles and her circles and how it's all connected and how we need to make sure that our services and supports are holistic. Do you have anything on that, Raquel?
I just feel it was great. I think that is so important, especially in the work that we're doing intersectional, that really, I think it comes down to meeting people where they're at. And, I think when I think about just policy work or just how our programs are working, or when you evaluate yourself, I think one great way to know that you're doing something right is that you have these resources and tools at your disposal, but yet, they are able to reach anyone who walks in that door, whether, again, intersecting identities, or, thinking about the traumas, the levels of trauma and the levels of oppression that, people face. That I think if you have something that really, really to its core, and I think that is that Indigenous perspective, that we all have this, we all have these things, but it's really how do we show up for each other. And something came to mind when you had talked about case management, and even thinking about just that language, that you're managing someone, which can be very um it could just lead to some resistance, or not wanting to do something because I don't want to be managed. So I think when we think about those language, think about language and the power of that, just two simple words, but yet the implications. And yes, it might, if we looked at it literally, well, that's what it is, right? You're managing this case, literally that's what you're doing. But then when you take into all of this context that Wyanet just talked about, whether it's historical, intergenerational, personal trauma, all the way down to identities, oppression, layers of oppression, those two words mean so much more than what you think it literally means. And so I think when we make space to think about that and think about what we're doing and keeping all of this in mind, you're going to create a space where people feel that they can come in and, you know, just be, and also that empowerment piece. Like, if you have all of these things, I think this is where it gets tricky, because, working with grants, I've had some times where, working with a program, they're like, well, we have to do this, because if we don't do this, it shows that we're not complying with the grant. Or if we don't do this, this is, you know, we're not showing success rates of our program. And I think going back to what Wyanet said is really going back to that strength based, maybe in our reports, we're not putting, if there is something that says they didn't show up to 2 financial literacy classes and you are afraid, add that story, kind of tell that story of, okay, the financial literacy classes didn't come, but guess what? This is what happened. This is what was achieved. And even though it might seem small, you're at least showing that, it came with big impact. And so I think, finding ways that you can do this um, is really going to be important. And then I think, even when I think about when you write your solicitations for grants, is this something that the grant specifically said they want you to do, or is this something that you put in there just because that's something we do, right? As programs, we think evidence-based, oh my goodness, we have to prove that this is working somehow, or we have to, do all these things. And reality is maybe we don't, or maybe we can talk to our grant person, or take this as an opportunity to say, look, financial literacy class doesn't work when we're working with our Indigenous relatives, because it implies so many things. It also taps into historical, intergenerational trauma of economic abuse, from our history. 'Cause when I think about it, not only are we, it might seem silly, but when we look from a historical context, financial literacy doesn't just mean on an individual level that it might be, something of resistance. But when you think about historical and intergenerational trauma, then it has all these other layers. So, take this as an opportunity to kind of reflect on that and think about how you can um, kind of lead the story when you're talking to your grants people, and really think about how you can make it work. Um, and I do know the reality. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes you are kind of, um, you are stuck with demonstrating this um, checkbox that you have to do, but how do you do it in a way that isn't just another checkbox? How are you doing it? Kind of being creative in that sense. And so I think that's all I was going to add on that. But just I think this is critical to know that there's all of these levels that we're impacted by.
I love that you brought up the language of management. So thank you. You're spot on. And the trauma of budgeting. I was at like a family gathering like a year ago, like pre-COVID. And my brother-in-law goes, "Yeah, I bought my house with a pack of beads." And I was like, "Excuse me?" Like, he goes, "It's not my fault that you natives can't budget." And I was like, "Oh, we're going to fight." We're going to fight. So yeah, when you talked about that, I was like, "Ooh, my brother-in-law." So that can absolutely be like very, yeah, that can bring up some stuff. So thank you for pointing both of those things out. Next slide, please.
So to get kind of into the application, we're kind of talking about some of the ways that we can, why it's important to think about culture and why we want to center that. And I think here are some applications that you can do that. You can do that. And I know a couple slides down, we'll talk more specifically about what activities can look like, but just the activities that we do. Maybe instead of a financial literacy class, you can have, an education group on, economic abuse, not just in an interpersonal relationship, but, thinking about historically economic abuse, what that was. Wyanet had mentioned a story of being forcibly removed away from our resources, being removed from that. And that is economic, that's abusive. So thinking about activities instead of, some of these things that we want to do, we want to make sure that culture is guiding what activities we do. The activities that we do, are they culturally relevant to what we want to do? Again, saying we talked about policies and protocols. Again, kind of going back to that sacred nonviolent circle, thinking about how do we in our policies promote, because when I think about policies and protocols, and I did not complete that thought, but a thought came into my head that I wanted to say, but policies and protocols, they are critical in shaping how we do things as a program. Our policies and protocols are kind of that extension of our culture. They guide our work. They guide how we do things. So, in our policies and protocols, if we are instilling in those protocols and in those policies fairness and a partnership, rather than this is our program, you're joining this program, whether we look at it as a partnership, things like that, that's going to shape how we show up. And culture is going to guide that. Culture is going to guide our policies and protocols and how we want to, show up as a program, and how we want to make sure our culture is the center, is the philosophical foundation of our work. That can be done through policies and protocols. Again, materials, our brochures, our, things that we hand out. I think if you're a program that's maybe not Native specific, but you have Native victims and survivors come in, make sure you have, Native specific resources that you can offer, and do it in a way that's not, I think one of the biggest, it can seem small, but when you walk in as a Native person into a mainstream organization and you need more cultural specific materials, it says a lot when, oh, we don't have that right now, I'll have to get that to you, later. I think it kind of sends a message that an afterthought of, we really, don't see this, so we don't have it, might have to wait. When you're prepared and when you have them available, it shows that you are mindful of who they are, as as a Native person walking in that door. So making sure you have them on hand and making sure they're available. Again, education groups. And I think, if you are a mainstream organization and you don't have, uh, you don't have that option to make, have a Native specific education group, again, partner out, see who does, have some collaboration there. Or, one thing I think is empowering and awesome is maybe a Native victim or survivor wants to take, would, want to lead that. Again, don't put that on them. Don't, let them kind of offer themselves. Don't try and say, hey, can you do this group for us? Because, but just think about other ways that you can provide that where it's more specific. And if you are a Native specific organization, we have a curriculum. The Hosea Advocate Program has an education group curriculum, and I think it's wonderful. I don't know if you can access a copy. You can email me or Wyanet. I know that we have that copy, and more than willing to share what we have, and so you can kind of see what that looks like and how culture is kind of that centering piece of that education group. So finding toolkits, finding resources out there if you don't have something. And then just the physical environment. I think, as you walk into a space, how is the culture guiding your physical space? And so there are just many ways that you can kind of bring culture in. These are just some, but just making sure that you keep that in mind and that it's kind of your guide in the work that you do.
Yeah, I would just add making sure things are accessible, that accessibility piece again. Um, is the physical environment accessible? Can someone with disabilities access your services? Um, can someone who is LGBT2 spirit access your services? How do they know that? Can they tell from your materials and your brochures that this is a safe and welcoming space for them? And if you can't, provide things like culturally specific services, who can? Who are your partners? What is your network? What is your circle? And I would encourage you to map it out, do your homework before, someone with disabilities comes in. So like now, so that you are prepared for, mobilizing and getting people the resources that they need.
Absolutely. I remember my brother was part of this diversity inclusion on his college campus. And I remember him telling me a story that the accessibility office was on the second floor and the elevator was out. So, it wasn't very accessible to go to the accessibility office. So again, just kind of thinking about that of, the what ifs. It might not ever happen. The elevator might not ever happen to go out, but in case that it does, how do you ensure people have access to you? And so that's a great point. Next slide, Scobie, please. I think we kind of touched on this. Again, it's just important. I think about the medicine wheel in this, or I just think about, that holistic healing we touched on, that we really want to make sure, if we're working with a victim or survivor, and maybe we're safety planning, we don't want to just focus on that physical safety. That's an important piece, absolutely, that, we want to focus on that. But we also want to think about emotional safety, spiritual safety, mental safety, all of these things. And not just in terms of safety planning, but responding. How are we responding in a holistically, holistically healing way, whether it's physical wellness, emotional wellness, spiritual wellness, and mental wellness. So, what are some things that you can offer for physical wellness? And, again, that could be foraging for traditional medicines or berries or, things like that, emotional, um, just again, kind of those women's education groups, um, spiritual. Are there elders that you can reach out to and have connect? And then, that mental wellness, how can you show up for that mental health aspect? I think in a cultural specific way, we want that culture to kind of encompass all of those things. Next slide, please. Unless you want to say anything, Wyanet, on that.
All right, so in the chat, what does decolonizing mean to you? What does decolonizing look like? What do you picture when you think about decolonizing? If anyone is willing to share that in the chat, that would be awesome. I love this quote, "The sea acknowledge and respect me as I truly am." Due to colonization, we've really brought in a lot of these binaries into our language, into our practices, into our socialization. And so for me, when I think about decolonizing, it's about breaking down these boundaries and creating more of a balance. Um, Thank you, Mickey, who you said when you change the perspective of the indigenous culture, absolutely. And if anyone else wants to chat in, that would be great. I'm really interested in how we seek out spectrums rather than these divides of like, well, good and bad, gay and straight, humans versus nature, or rich versus poor. Whereas I'm neither good nor bad. I'm somewhere in between. I know that I've hurt people. I know I've caused harm. Um, and I know I've done some good things in my life too. So I'm just kind of somewhere in the middle, kind of balanced between there, hopefully more good than bad. But it's not this like, black versus white, or like this photo like has a lot of black and white, for that like contrast. Um, Whereas we're all kind of in the middle and kind of like seeking this balance within our lives. Um, and so for me, part of that is the way that we interact with and advocate for our LGBT and two-spirit relatives. Um, I love the term two-spirit because for me, it just encapsulates that whole idea of that our spirit is what defines us, rather than, this good versus bad, or, rich versus poor, that it's our spirit. And I will say that there's Native members of the LGBT plus community who wouldn't automatically identify as two spirits. And some tribes use the term in a different way too. Thank you, Lily. Lily says reclaiming. That's great. The term two-spirit has been around since like the 90s. And if you're interested in learning more about that, we can definitely send you some resources. Just reach out to us. But the biggest thing is being LGBT plus two-spirit, it's not new. And because of colonization and the way that we've built colonization into our practices, our LGBT two-spirit relatives experience horrible abuses. They'll be alienated when they come out. There's, discriminatory practices and bullying, hate crimes from homophobia, family rejection when they come out. unemployment because of discriminatory practices, which leads to a lot of poverty. Um, there's a lot of times when our LGBT two-spirit relatives aren't welcome at cultural practices or by the cultural community or the tribal community. Um, and then they tend to have a lot of unreported sexual assaults and physical assaults because there's a lot of like victim blaming things, and they're belittled or they're not believed. So part of this work to restore honor and restore balance and to create this harmony and get out of this dichotomy and the binaries is about how we help remove barriers. So like thinking about Lily, thank you. Yeah, deconstructing and weaving or reweaving. That's awesome. How we challenge and confront homophobia so that our relatives aren't in danger when they come out. Um, Thinking about how our two-spirit relatives were honored and sacred and how to bring that back. Um, Decolonizing in a way that shows that honor and creates safety and welcoming spaces for our relatives to be who they truly are. I'm somewhere in between good and bad, and that's who I am. And that's, you know, it's just kind of somewhere in between, and that's who I am as a person, and that's what I bring to the table. Um, and I wouldn't expect anyone else to do differently because we're just humans. Um, Make sure survivors who are LGBT2 spirit have those resources and that they can get assistance. And then educate within your own program and then your community about homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, because thinking about how other people respond, it really makes a difference on how our two-spirit relatives navigate through the world and the community and the legal system. So, law enforcement, um, educating them, or, every member of the court system from our jurors to our judges. Um, and then making sure to absolutely acknowledge and address that kind of specific intergenerational and historical and personal trauma that our two-spirit relatives have had to endure. If you're interested in any kind of like basic starting points for kind of like training and education, you can think about like um, cultural humility and diversity, the impact of oppression, and kind of different layers of oppression, from like microaggressions onto like uh, someone burning a cross in your yard, like that spectrum of hate crimes. Um, Training on how past experiences impact people now, or training on discrimination and like stigmas and biases. Um, and then like training on how to build social supports and community supports. Those are all really great places to start internally, if you're interested in that.
Yeah, I think just reflecting on, you know, what were some of your tribes or your communities' traditional beliefs, when it comes to gender roles. And because, yeah, some might have two genders, some might have three, four, that fluidity. I love that Wyanet kind of put the spectrum, because I also think that, one day you can be good, the next day you could be bad, the other day you can be in between. Like you're never in one space. It's never constant. There's always these changing, you know, things. And I think that when we think about colonization and decolonization, I think, the colonized perspective is that sexuality and gender it's this line that you are or you're not, and that wherever you are, you never move. And I think that if we were to look back at, I don't want to speak for every tribe or every indigenous community, but for a huge part of, indigenous belief systems is that we know it was very fluid, that there were, that it's not just binary, it's not, and if it, I think there's that piece of just reclaiming some of that and then also making space for, this fluidity. And I think Wyanet is spot on that if we can make sure that we're looking to those traditional beliefs and making sure, we provide this space, that really is how you center culture in your program, because you've already done this work to make it where, it's not this binary belief. So I just think it's really a great place, are to use those resources, and also just to think about what was your community's perspective, what were their beliefs, and how did they define, pre-colonization? How did that look? And yeah, and to just reinforce why not, all of those layers, and how, we want to be mindful of showing up for those layers, and yeah.
Next slide, please.
So I think that we're going to have an idea board where just some things that I wanted, that we wanted to kind of reflect on are just what are some ways in which you can incorporate some of your culture into your program or practices, and what will be some challenges. So kind of list, and of course so Hanovi put it in the chat box, the link. You can click on that and it will show, but it won't show your name of like whatever you put on there. Just ways in which you can incorporate some culture into your program, just some things that kind of sparked your interest from this webinar. And then just to think about some challenges that might come up as you're incorporating some of that into your program. Or, what would be a challenge if you wanted to do that?
Yeah, so if you click on this link, it'll take you to idea boards. And if you click on the little plus button, it'll bring up a little note. And so you can type things in here that, you're thinking about. And I pressed enter and it's stuck. And then if you wanted to get another little plus, you can do that. In the what are some challenges, this could also be things that you might want some resources on. So like if you are thinking about curriculums, you could type that in there. And you couldn't see, oh, that's not updating on our screen. You couldn't see that I wrote those, and so they are anonymous. If you'd like to put some things in there, that would be great.
And you can even like them, like if curriculum is like, hey, that's something I like, there's a +0 and you can hit on that just to,
Is anyone having problems issuing it or, getting to it? It's funny because I can see things happening when I open idea boards, but it's not updating on our screen. So someone wrote in education groups under what are some ways in which you could incorporate some of your culture into your program and practices. Someone just said learning more and solving the problem before it becomes a problem, like the ability to even access services. Absolutely. Challenges, someone said funding. Something that we do on our level, like at the national level, oh, it updated, yay, is like we'll build in traditional supplies into our conference budgets so that we can pass out things like sage and sweetgrass lavender supplies, things like that. And we do build it into our conference budgets. Someone said teachings, the medicine wheel is a template to process services, needs, etc.
I love that idea to think about, when we are asking, what are some services that you need? I think it is important to kind of break it down through that medicine wheel of like, what are, through each, area, what are some needs? And I think that's a great way to incorporate that.
Okay, well, feel free to keep adding to that for the next couple of minutes. And we can move on to the next slide. Awesome. So these are some examples of traditional and cultural activities to think about what you can offer, what your partner agencies can offer, what volunteers can offer. You might think about different kinds of ceremonies, or, what songs or prayers can people learn? Maybe you'll, figure out how to do a healing garden that's at like an apartment complex where you're housing participants are living, or where you can harvest and share sacred medicines, how to build in that connection with land and animals. Um, if you have a volunteer who wants to and is willing to like lead talking circles, maybe thinking about how you could provide a stipend for time and travel, or if they're more interested in facilitating as kind of like an in-kind donation, or if you need a match donation, those kind of things for your grants. You might want to build in some specific like healing ceremonies, or spiritual teachings. You might think about like coming of age ceremonies that your participants could attend and participate in, or thinking about creation stories that you could share as a part of that talking circle and healing activities, or like full moon ceremonies or solstice stories. You could think about like pregnancy teachings or birthing ceremonies, things like naming ceremonies, or what your tribes traditionally did with the placenta, things like that. Child rearing practices that you could build in. Teachings around like the 4 stages of life and how we're interconnected, and that kinship and the circles. And not all of these things have to be something that you think about as like a checkbox. It doesn't have to be this kind of financial service that's offered, or something that your progress report is going to necessarily ask about. It might not be something that you track. It might be something that you put into a narrative, or something that you talk to your grant manager about. But really thinking about how to build in these supportive services, because these supportive services are such an integral part of healing and creating that circle of healing. You can build it into your everyday advocacy, when someone comes in and you're just smudging with them, and building in these practices that you do day to day. You can really weave the cultural aspects into all of your programming, like we talked about earlier, the policies and the procedures and how to build that stuff in. If you use like a mainstream curriculum, how can that be modified? You don't have to take a curriculum and use it word for word. Even if you reach out to us and we share the HSEA curriculum, you can modify those kind of things. And so really think about how to build these into your day-to-day activities.
Yeah, and I would just, if you have elders in your community, reach out to them if they're willing, another piece, even elder abuse. How do you, have these activities that respond and are accessible? But reaching out to elders and see, how, if they want to share some perspectives. I think it can be hard when you are in an urban native area or, you don't quite know. But I think, just reaching out and whether that's to Hope, that's her project through Red Wind, reaching out to her to, if you want to figure out how to do some of these things, she's there to really help guide you for that. And I really like, so on the idea board, someone mentioned creating space for healing. So definitely, I love that, because I think it's kind of like, when we're in this field, it's like, okay, business only, well, I know I like to chat, and I know, just creating that space where it's not just, we want to get through your goals, if that's what you're doing, or we're just getting through it, but you're really creating this space that is really intentional on, healing. And that is, I think, the critical space. The critical piece is that you are intentional with, the healing process. I think that is really, when we think of violence and experiencing violence, the cultural response is that intention for healing. So I really like that, creating that space. And you can reach out to Wyanet or me or Hope on just maybe some ideas on what you're thinking about, what that space could look like, or how you could do that. And then someone mentioned purposely rotating leadership and sharing, like teachers sharing, and I love that. And I think, just to touch on another activity, maybe it could be participants putting together Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's and our Two-Spirit, march, or, anything that we find to get them, active. And if they would like, I think those are great opportunities, that, those activities. And then again, something that I would love in education groups is maybe having, one person take on that education group, take on the role of, take on that role to be the facilitator for a group and kind of guide it. And I love that idea, to just really rotate that, because we can get into that hierarchical, I'm this person, you're the participant. So I know we're over, so I didn't know questions. I know Wyanet put in the chat box if you have questions. And then Wyanet. Oh, go ahead.
No, just advance 2 slides so that they can have our contact information too. We just had questions and then our contact information. So Hope is the one who leads the project here at Red Wind on urban projects and urban programming. So you can reach out to her. Raquel works on campus. I work on housing and shelters. So you can reach out to us about those kind of things too. Red Wind also has an elder abuse project, and then children and youth as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can reach out to us later. But really appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Alrighty, thank you both. Before we end the session, I would like to let you all know that once the webinar closes, you'll be getting a pop-up for a survey. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we very much appreciate it. If you aren't able to do so right now, you'll also be getting one via email in about a day. Coming up next is the Understanding Confidentiality webinar, which is on February 11th at 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Once again, that is Understanding Confidentiality on February 11th at 1 p.m. MST. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenters, Wyanet and Raquel. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.